Hi, Olivia, and welcome to the Maestro Online.
Hi, Robin. Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you. Now, you are very much a name at the moment in the world of vocal pedagogy, so singing and really understanding vocal health. But where did your musical journey begin? Did you have a very musical household or?
Oh, well, not particularly, but I was very lucky to grow up in the 80s and 90s where there was lots of music available in the area in which I lived. So I benefited from growing up in London
Mhm.
and learning instruments as a child as part of the local government scheme, and then as a teenager in one of the government run specialist music colleges. So I was, really benefited from that opportunity to get involved in the music that was around and about in the London Borough of Hounslow. So, you know, the halcyon days of state music.
Yeah, they were great days. I mean, I myself learnt clarinet for free and was lent a clarinet to use, etc., etc., and it was part of my beginnings.
Yeah, exactly
So,
the same here. Luncello for free is part of the whole opportunity for kids who were interested in that sort of thing. Took part in recorder groups,
yeah,
and then eventually, as a teen, took part in one of the specialist music colleges that was in Hounslow, and I think it's still there today. Actually, it's one of the few remaining colleges that's still being run for kids from the London Borough. So I thought that was
yeah,
it was a
that's
great opportunity to be involved in music.
fabulous.
Yeah.
So, what about singing? Because there you've mentioned instruments.
Yes, true. Well, singing was always part of it as well. There was daily singing in the primary school. We sang the standard hymns. Someone used to come in each week and do about an hour of singing with us. I remember, sitting on the hall floor and singing along to all the favourites, and that was
Mhm.
just sort of part of normal life. And I went to church on Sundays and sang as part of the sort of Sunday school offering there. And I
Yeah.
spent a bit of time in a church choir as well when I could fit it in. And it was just a normal thing to do in those days, just being part of classroom singing and part of choirs all the way through my childhood.
So, at what point did you go from loving music as a child to start thinking, "Oh, this is getting quite serious here. I'm getting good at this, and I want to take it a bit more seriously."
I think that's probably when it came to the sort of GCSE or GCSE equivalent years,
Yeah.
where for the first time I had to decide whether I wanted to choose it or not. So I think up until the end of Key Stage 3, up until the end of Year 9, it was just part of the normal curriculum, wasn't it? And
Yeah.
then at Year 10, you had to decide whether you actually wanted to carry on doing it as a subject or not. And I absolutely elected for it because I was enjoying playing the cello, and I was having piano lessons, and it was definitely something that was, one of my favourite subjects. So I carried on, took music at, year 10, year 11, and then selected it as an A level, thank goodness.
So, the decision to take music as a career is a much bigger one, and often I don't know whether they were for you, but you often can get people around you trying to persuade you that it's best as a hobby rather than a career and those kind of things. Was it an easy transition for you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Again, I think I benefit from being around at the right time when university education was free,
Yeah.
and there wasn't such a pressure on taking a vocational degree as I think there perhaps is now.
Yes.
Us going to university was very much about whether you got in rather than whether you were choosing something that was going to set you up for life. So
Yeah.
for me, it was an opportunity to choose a subject that I really enjoyed. I hadn't actually initially intended to do music, but I finally managed to come round to the idea by the time I was halfway through the upper sixth. And it was still not too late to apply. And so I did apply and got into various places to read music, and just saw that as a great opportunity to do the thing I most loved at university. Lucky me.
So, what about those university years? Did they naturally lead into your career? Were there particular experiences that you really remember that were, you know, pivotal perhaps in your life?
Yeah, actually, yes. So I went to Durham, and Durham is collegiate in that there you're based in a college, and a lot of the stuff that you do is college based. So I got involved in college music from the outset, auditioned for the chapel choir, got into the chapel choir, and had a really exciting experience singing evensong and Eucharist services, mostly evensong services. And then I also got involved in the string orchestra. And in the second year, I set my own orchestra up. And that was really the catalyst for this being in charge of music. And I I mean, looking back, it seems quite you can kind of see sort of why how my career has developed from that because I set up my own orchestra and I thought how nice it would be to go into the local schools, the local primary schools and local secondary schools, take the orchestra in, and play music to them and get them to really sit amongst us and enjoy listening to the music we were making. And I did eventually go on to become a teacher, but this was prior to that. And I hadn't
Yeah,
particularly intended to be a teacher at the time, but I just thought it'd be really fun to take the orchestra into primary schools and show them what we were all about. So I set these workshops up as a student, took a load of orchestral musicians into schools, and talked to children. And the schools are very happy to have us. And I can imagine looking back, they were thrilled that
yeah,
an enthusiastic university student got in touch and said, would it be okay if I brought my orchestra of 18 to 21-year-olds along and played you some great classical music and the children could enjoy listening to it? I mean, they're probably thrilled. And so yeah, that's what we did. Went in, so I set up these workshops and we did these workshops in schools and I was running the orchestra as well in a conventional way and having concerts. And that was the sort of thing I thought I might go on to do, not necessarily become a teacher as such, but go on to perhaps work in an organization doing sort of animateur work or the sort of work in perhaps in an opera house or for an orchestra, the education side of things, sort of education officer. But
yeah.
those jobs weren't quite as prevalent in those days, in the early 2000s, as they are now. And there weren't a huge number of them. Generally, they were London based. And the sort of entry level salaries were really low compared to being a teacher. So I was a bit pragmatic about it. And
Yes,
in the
and
end,
outside of London, you had your local education authority who would have a music advisor
right.
who would then oversee the schools in general and county orchestras and county choirs. So it was a different system, wasn't it?
It was a different system in those. We didn't really have the hubs that we have
No,
these days. And a lot of the arts organisations didn't necessarily have the same outreach as they have now.
no.
That's really something that's evolved over the last 20 years.
Yeah,
So I decided to go off and do a PGCE, one of those postgraduate certificates of education, so that I would acquire the skills to be able to do that kind of education work, but also have the necessary skills that I would need to become a teacher. And that's in fact what I ended up doing.
yeah. And of course, a teacher would be regarded as a enjoyable but a secure job as well, which would, establish your beginning as a career as a musician.
Yeah, very much. Well, it really was a pragmatic decision, actually, from that point of
Yeah,
view. Yes.
yeah. So you are no longer in that world. So somewhere along the line, that has changed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I am now freelance, which is really exciting. And I'm sort of doing some of the things that I spoke about, wanting to do when I was a student, because now I am, in fact, going into primary schools and doing these sorts of workshops. So it
Yeah.
has sort of come full circle rather magically for me, and rather brilliantly.
So at what point did you decide to leave teaching? And I imagine that was, as we've said, it's a pragmatic solution teaching because it's a reliable career. There'll always be a need for teachers. It's a steady income. At what point did you make that decision, and was it an easy decision to make?
Yes, so it must be, let me think, a couple of years ago now, when I was working in the independent sector, and the independent sector started to realize that there were going to be issues. I think problems with just numbers, and as we know, since January this year, VAT on school fees has really changed what the independent sector is like.
Yeah,
And so some of the opportunities that used to be in those schools just aren't really there anymore.
no.
And one has to look in different places to do the sorts of things that I was loving doing as a school teacher.
No.
But it's ended up working out really well. So
So part of your mission is vocal health. It's something you strongly believe in, and you've published a book on, and it's
yes.
something that you widely talk about.
Absolutely right. So, in fact, how long ago would that be now? 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, I thought that I would do a master's, in vocal health in particular, a vocal pedagogy master's. It was a new master's that had recently been launched. I wasn't the inaugural cohort, but I think I was one of the early cohorts, for that master's degree. And I ended up doing things that were very pertinent to the work that I was doing in school at the time. But also, I've always really been interested in children's voices and the developing voice and the changing voice, and also helping children as their voices change to look after their voices, and helping children who have, vocal issues with their voices to look after them. Because one of the big things I was doing in schools was running a variety of different sorts of choirs at various levels, sort of national level and very much all comers style choirs, and going out and doing various workshops to do with that as well. So voice and choirs, and in fact composing for voice, has always been something I've been very interested in. And this master's really came about as, it gave me the opportunity to do a lot of reading, a lot of research, which was really exciting. And absolutely, that it did in fact lead to me writing this book, having the book published just over a year ago. And that has led to a variety of opportunities in running workshops and giving talks and presenting my ideas, and also teaching myself on that same master's course now, which has been a great thing to do.
Now, obviously, there's no doubt that you are passionate about vocal health, and it's something that you believe people should be made more aware of, etc. And they should take an interest in it without being overly serious, still having fun,
Of course.
but doing it in a good way.
Yeah.
Um, have you found it difficult to find people being receptive? That's the idea, because there could be people who are saying children can sing anyway, and we don't see a problem. Where is this problem? Have you found it difficult getting them to
Yeah.
understand where you're coming from?
That's a really interesting question, because sort of anecdotally, there are people I've heard of who do have that sort of stuff and nonsense approach.
Yes.
It seems to be a generational thing, that I think some of the new generation coming in are much more aware of how important it is to look after children holistically, to look after every aspect of their health, and not just be interested in, just how they are in choir, but also to be aware of them as, as healthy humans, mentally and physically healthy humans. And there's more care, I think, these days, generally speaking, of choristers, so professional young singers and musical theatre performers, professional young musical theatre performers, and also children in general who are singing in choirs, national and local choirs as well. But there is a concern that one of the statistics I remember is that up to a third of primary school children might have some vocal health issue, or on some level. A huge number of
Wow.
children out there who could potentially have some sort of problem with their voice. Often these things rectify themselves and sort themselves out, but there are a surprising number of children who are in speech and language therapy, or or just end up having a problem with their voice that's never really resolved, which
Yeah.
does affect their quality of life. So, it is an important thing to be aware of. And I think that a small amount of education in this area can actually be really beneficial for children in general, but very much so for children who are professional voice users. So I'm thinking about, cathedral choristers, and children who are on the stage in musical theatre and that sort of thing.
Yes, I was going to ask you about those. So musical
Yeah.
theatre and cathedral, obviously, those kind of people can be in performances as such on a daily basis. So they are using their voice, and often in not just using it, but with certain elements of their repertoire, maybe using their voice to certain extremes, and in the way that an athlete uses muscles and has to take care of their muscles.
Yeah, the analogy is excellent. You're absolutely right. It's exactly the same thing. The muscles are engaged. The quite fragile muscles are engaged in the larynx and in the rest of the body as well to support the sound. The abdominal muscles to control that exhalation, to lend support to the sound production. And we should treat them in the same way as we treat gymnasts and other professional children and young people. The book is actually relevant really from about the age of 8 or 9, so about when you would start being a professional singer, as a chorister or as a musical theatre performer, up to when you might consider, if you're at school, going on to do music at music college or at a conservatoire or at one of the specialist MT colleges. So it's
Yeah.
really relevant from sort of age 8, 9, right up to sort of age 18, 19, all the way through that sort of, important time in a child's development.
So let's just talk a little bit about um, vocal health and the elements that may be in that.
Mm.
So, for instance, people often talk about warm ups, and more recently, I think people pay more attention to cool downs as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Both those things are really relevant and worthwhile. Cool downs are particularly useful if you are going to be singing the following day. So anyone who's doing a run of shows, be that at school level, if you've got a set of performances at Christmas, the school musical's on, or you've got several concerts, one in a row, or there's just quite a lot of singing going on, perhaps in the weeks leading up to performances, then cool downs can really help the performer to reset the larynx and to relax the muscles and to get a good night's sleep and then be ready for the following day. So yeah, warm-ups and cool downs are just as important in singing as they are in sports. They have the same level of importance. Really, really important to warm up the body before you try and do any sort of singing and to cool down afterwards. Really important.
And what about somebody who's maybe is a passionate admirer of somebody like Beyonce, and they're trying to copy their vocal runs and the extreme range and that some of these fantastic international singers have, the Whitney Houstons of the world. How important do you think it is that they get some professional lessons to, you know, ensure that they are singing these amazing things healthily when they're trying to emulate some really astonishing voices by people who have something exceptional to start with?
Yeah, it's been interesting for us, isn't it, on our TVs, seeing children being lauded for sounding like adult singers.
Yeah.
Perhaps we're coming out of that now. I'm not sure. Certainly, I remember some high profile children from sort of 15 years ago who had, amazingly mature sounding voices who are, these angels. And sadly, they haven't really gone on to have adult careers because I think probably their voices didn't really mature in the sort of conventional way, and they haven't then been able to use their voices as adults. So I can't really speculate on what happened to them vocally, but the young performer often dies from view, and you don't really know what's happened. I imagine there would be some kind of issue that has stopped them going on to be a performer. We can't speculate. Who knows?
No.
But yes, no, you're right. It's a tricky thing when a child who has a particular size larynx and a particular developing vocal mechanism tries to imitate the sounds that we hear produced by an adult who might be 30 plus. Their voices are much more developed as instruments than a child's is going to be, and the child would have to do quite a lot of vocal gymnastics to make some of those sounds. Now, children's voices are very flexible and they can do amazing things. But then it becomes frustrating for the child as their voices develop and change through adolescence, because their voices do become less flexible, not quite as able to do some of the things that they were able to do when their larynxes were much smaller, and slightly differently shaped. So I think that's partly why sometimes we see these prodigies not developing into fully fledged, amazing performers in their own right.
Yeah, and you've hinted at touching on another aspect, which is emulating there.
Mm.
The idea that people try to sound like somebody else when perhaps their body isn't built to sound like that person, even if they were an adult. And also the idea that when we want to sound like somebody, in reality, we can only ever be a shadow of that person, because surely we've got to be true to ourselves, our own body, our own voice, and have integrity and honesty vocally.
Yes, it's a really good point, actually. And it's very true, of course, that we all have unique instruments with their own unique sounds because our body is part of what makes our instrument unique. I mean, unlike perhaps a flute or a cello or a clarinet, where you can probably make the instruments sound quite similar to each other with voices. It's quite hard to have that, to have voices sounding exactly the same, isn't it? So yes, I think the emergence of so many karaoke style backing tracks and recordings out there, make it really easy for children to get sort of lulled into that false sense of excellence, when what they all they are doing is really literally attempting to sort of imitate what they hear on a recording. And well, I think whenever you see those programs of children trying to do that, you can make your own judgment, and you can see that imitation is not quite the same as their own individual voice. And these days, I think more frequently, people who are judging on those sorts of shows actually do praise it when it is the child's own voice, and celebrate it when it does sound personal and as if it is the character of the child who is performing is coming across, rather than that idea of them sounding like someone else.
Do you think that there's been an increase in need for awareness of vocal health since COVID?
Well,
Or it could even perhaps be in relation to perhaps people feeling more anxious. Perhaps more and more we hear of teenagers now suffering from anxiety than we used to have. Whether that's because we're more aware, or whether that's because of COVID and the lockdowns, and then the coming out of lockdowns, and parents being anxious during COVID, and that feeling being passed on to children as they grow up, for instance.
yes. Well, I mean, you've brought up a load of possibilities there, but actually, the statistics tell us that there is more anxiety in the young. So if you look at the graphs, there are in the younger the demographic, the more anxiety there is. I don't know whether that's specifically down to COVID. I mean, there are so many things that cause stress and anxiety among our young, not least social media, which I know is a concern of lots of professionals.
So do you think that anxiety has connected with vocal health? Do you think there's more need to be aware of vocal health because of that increased anxiety in the younger population?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, certainly, I in my book I cover performance anxiety,
Yeah.
and there are physical symptoms of performance anxiety which ought to be addressed, and not swept under the carpet or ignored. And there are things that you can do to help children give their best performance and not allow themselves to be overwhelmed by physical symptoms. So I think, as we spoke earlier, didn't we, about the kind of holistic education of a child, not just interested in how their voice is sounding in the performance, but that sense of looking after the whole person and looking after them physically and mentally, as they grow as individuals, and how, as you know, as teachers and as conductors and as house parents in boarding situations, it's absolutely crucial to be aware of all those aspects that come together to make the child a whole.
Yes. And it's a long-term vision we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So with our long-term vision, looking back over your wonderful career, can you think of one moment that is going to be the one that you're going to remember for your life? Can you think of one thing in your musical journey that stands out?
Well, we're talking a lot about choirs at the moment, and about singing and about children. And I think some of the standout moments for me are when one of my choirs won Choir of the Year competition, because that really was, an incredible achievement for the choir. And of course, I say choir, but the choir consists of 24 individuals coming together to create the most amazing effect, bringing all these voices together and creating this sort of stunning one, as it were, many becoming one, and then receiving the praise of judges, so much so that we are national champions. That was a tremendously exciting moment, but also a real accolade and acknowledgement of all the work that we collectively put in to make that happen, because all the practice and all the preparation coming good is a really marvelous thing. And I know it's the same with sport. All the effort you put into preparing a team for a competition, and then having that success is really quite similar to the sort of thing that we might do in a choral setting. So I appreciate why it's such a big deal in sport, and why it's so exciting to watch. But from my point of view, it was a real achievement, and something that will, I think, endure in the minds of everyone who took part, in the children children and in the parents who are there to watch, and certainly for me.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask you one final question. Can you give us one Olivia Pearl of wisdom?
Well, on the topic of vocal health, I would say that the number one piece of advice I would give is to make sure you are well hydrated. So to drink regularly throughout the day, often throughout the day, start drinking water early in the day and have, regular glasses of water or regular bottles of water throughout the day. And if you can do that one thing, on a regular basis, so you really are staying well hydrated, it changes every aspect of your life. Clarity of thought, absolutely vocal health, and physical health as well. And I think it's the one thing that many children, young people, adults aren't necessarily doing, but could really feel so much better in themselves if they were. So yes, stay hydrated, and drink more water.
Olivia, thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure, Rob.